On the 9th of June 2020, Burundi's outgoing President Pierre Nkurunziza was announced dead, marking the end of an era of Burundi's longest-serving president. His sudden illness and death stunned the world, which prompted many questions given Burundi's attitude and how it handled the coronavirus. In death, as in life, Pierre Nkurunziza remains deeply controversial and divisive. In this episode, we shall look at the reign of Pierre Nkurunziza. Pierre Nkurunziza was born in December 1964, one among the 6 siblings to Eustace Ngabisha, a Hutu parliamentarian and governor, who was killed during the 1972 massacres, and his mother Domitille Minani, who was an assistant nurse from a Tutsi ethnic group. He excelled in his studies and was working as a lecturer at the University of Burundi in 1995, when a massacre of Hutu students on campus took place. He narrowly survived an attempt on his life, since the massacres targeted Hutu students and staff. The perpetrators were Tutsi, among of which were students. On escape, he joined the Council for the Defense of Democracy, Forces for the Defense of Democracy, CNDD-FDD rebel movement, where he swiftly rose in ranks. He became the Deputy Secretary General in 1998, and it was around this time that he was sentenced to death in absentia by the government. In 2001, he was elected chairman, and after a split in the movement, he was re-elected again in 2004. In August 2000, the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, otherwise known as the Arusha Accords, was signed after a protracted negotiations facilitated by former presidents Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Nelson Mandela of South Africa, which ended 12 years of civil war. The accords were based on 4 points of agreement. Number 1, a power-sharing formula based on an agreed formula of ethnic quotas in politics. Number 2, representation of all parties in the state of bureaucracy. Number 3, constitutional restrictions to prevent any single party becoming excessively powerful. Number 4, pathways to integrate former rebels and minority groups in Burundian armed forces. The central tenets of the Arusha Accords were subsequently added to the Constitution of Burundi. Later, the CNDD-FDD registered as a political party in 2004 and won majority in the 2005 legislative elections. Pierre Nkurunziza was elected as president in a vote by members of parliament in August 2005, marking the beginning of his 15-year rule. The start of Nkurunziza's presidency was a moment of great hope for many Burundians. He introduced free primary education, free maternity care for all of which were popular measures, and by 2009 he had abolished the death penalty. However, Nkurunziza's reputation became increasingly tarnished in a face of political functionalism, corruption, and continued insecurity. He presided over a wide scale of purges of opponents and the muffling of press. He also oversaw the rise of the much-dreaded youth militia known as the Imbonerakure that terrorized any real and perceived opponents. In July of 2010, Nkurunziza was re-elected for a second term with a big majority, only that he was unopposed. You see, in the lead-up to the election, 12 opposition candidates formed a coalition known as the Alliance of Democratic Change and agreed on a boycott of the June elections, citing massive rigging in a previous local election by the CNDD-FDD ruling party. In the election, the number of voters had exceeded the number of votes counted and also exceeded the number of registered voters. So in response, the government declared the boycott illegal and banned the opposition from any sorts of meeting and arrested scores. The violence intensified 2 days to the election. Grenade attacks thundered through the capital Bujumbura, killing politicians and intimidating voters in opposition neighborhoods. On election day, 3 more grenade attacks occurred in Bujumbura, while 2 more exploded in north of the country. The main opposition party, known as the National Liberation Forces (FNL), under Agathon Rwasa, was suspected of being behind the grenade attacks. However, the FNL denied involvement in the attacks and claimed Rwasa was being targeted for political reasons. Nkurunziza went on to win his second term with 90% of the vote, as the main opposition leader Agathon Rwasa went into hiding due to speculation that the government wanted to arrest him on charges of planning a new insurgency. Just after a disputed election marred with election violence and rigging, Nkurunziza's second term saw a rising discontent, mistrust, and unpopularity with his leadership. He got obsessed with controlling and imposing his rule on the people of Burundi. At this stage, he had exhibited signs that power had started to corrupt him. In March of 2014, with protests brewing over a rumored third term, he restricted jogging to approved locations and forced each and every jogger in the country to register. In return, the opposition responded with calls for his ouster, which turned into riots and assassinations. The torture of bodies of opposition members began showing up on the outskirts of the town. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the country. On April 25, 2015, the ruling CNDD-FDD party officially announced that Nkurunziza would be its candidate in the June elections. This sparked widespread demonstrations and protests in the capital. The announcement threatened and risked the country's fragile peace, as highlighted in the Arusha Peace Accord and Burundi's constitution, where it was agreed that a president should rule for 2 terms, and here was Nkurunziza seeking a third. However, his allies argued that the first term did not count, as he was appointed by the parliament and not the people. The protests intensified as the Constitutional Court sided with Nkurunziza and approved his right to run for office for a third term. The decision was made under enormous pressure and death threats by the CNDD-FDD officials towards the 7 judges. Well, this was according to the Vice President of Burundi's Constitutional Court, Judge Silverini Mpagarise, who later fled the country for fear of his life. At this point, Nkurunziza relied on the much dreaded and feared Imbonerakure, meaning those who see from afar, visionaries, to carry out acts of violence, intimidation, rape, and murder against the opposition and protesters. Cracks started to appear on his grip to power when one of his former generals attempted a coup against his government on the 13th of May 2015. Earlier in February, General Godfrey Niyombare had sent a personal note to the president advising him not to seek a third term. As a result, this got him fired. He used the chance when Nkurunziza had traveled to Arusha, Tanzania for talks with other regional leaders about the situation in Burundi, and announced that he had overthrown the government and was forming a new transitional government. The rebel soldiers seized the airport in Bujumbura, and when Nkurunziza attempted to fly back to Burundi, his plane was turned back to Tanzania. After fierce fighting with the coup leaders, the coup collapsed. The government forces reasserted control and arrested the coup leaders. On the 11th of December, almost 90 people had been killed and thousands had fled the country. On the 10th of June 2015, various oppositional leaders called for a boycott of the election, rejecting the notion of holding the vote amidst the ongoing protests and controversy regarding Nkurunziza's re-election bid. Although the opposition candidates pulled out of the race, their names remained on the ballot, and on the 25th of July 2015, the Electoral Commission announced Nkurunziza that he had won the election with 69% of the vote, and Agathon Rwasa placed second, credited with 18% of the vote, despite calling for a boycott and not taking part. The regional and international bodies said that the conditions for a credible and a free elections were not met. In his third term, his government continued to violently suppress the media, opposition, with political killings continuing at a steady pace. In 2016, the ICC started preliminary investigations into possible crimes against humanity, following reports of killing, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. as well as cases of enforced disappearances. In response, the country withdrew its membership from the ICC and became the first country in the world to do so, accusing the ICC of deliberately targeting Africans for persecution. Despite having already served 3 terms, the self-proclaimed pastor was already drunk on power, and so he moved towards a referendum on constitutional changes which could allow him to hang over power until 2034. You see, the amendments would let him stand for re-election for 2 more terms and extend the length of his presidential terms from 5 to 7 years. The opposition called upon the people to boycott the referendum vote, which it accused of being a death warrant of the Arusha Accords of 2000, which had ended the civil war. In December 2017, Nkurunziza threatened people not to campaign against the proposed changes and issued a presidential decree that threatened 3 years imprisonment for anyone convicted of encouraging people not to vote. The amendments passed by 70% of the vote. In an unexpected move, however, he announced he would step down and not seek re-election in 2020, specifically endorsing one of his most trusted men, Evariste Ndayishimiye. In return, he introduced a new law that stated that at the end of his mandate, he will receive a luxury villa built with public funds in the location of his choice within 5 years, as well as a one-off allocation of 1 billion Burundian francs, equivalent to $530,000. The law would also elevate him to the title of Supreme Leader. The proposal was described as exorbitant by some, especially for a country that has 65% of its population under the poverty line. But the consensus was that Nkurunziza not running in the upcoming election was the best thing for the country. With no funds to run the election due to sanctions and funding being cut by the international community, Nkurunziza called upon Burundians to contribute money towards the election. He relied heavily on the structures like the ruling party's youth militia wing, the Imbonerakure, for enforcement of contributions from the public. And then coronavirus came along. Whereas it had the entire world on its knees with lockdowns and social distancing, in Burundi it wasn't the case. Open campaign rallies were held both by Evariste Ndayishimiye, the CNDD-FDD candidate, and opposition candidate Agathon Rwasa of the CNL. In one of the rallies, Nkurunziza said that God had purified Burundi's air and that no masks were necessary for his blessed land. When the World Health Organization criticized the government for not following the guidelines, he expelled the top World Health Organization representative and 3 other experts coordinating the coronavirus response from the country. International election monitors were also prevented from observing the election by subjecting them to mandatory 14 days in quarantine, which some saw as a way of discouraging them from going at all. Ndayishimiye won the elections with 68% of the vote. However, the fairness of the poll was widely questioned as it occurred in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. It had been reported that Nkurunziza wanted to run the country from behind the scenes, using Ndayishimiye as a puppet after his resignation. This did not come to pass as he died unexpectedly on the 8th of June 2020, aged 55 at the 5th anniversary hospital in Karuzi. Burundian government gave his cause of death as a heart attack, but some in the media suspected he died of COVID-19. Earlier, The Standard, a Kenyan newspaper, had reported that his wife and 2 bodyguards had been flown to Nairobi, Kenya for COVID-19 treatment. So his death occurred after the 2020 elections, but ahead of a projected handover in August, which led to the acceleration of the handover to close the power vacuum. Heavy expectations have been pinned on the new president, Evariste Ndayishimiye. The new president must break away from Nkurunziza's tainted legacy. Burundi's future lies in renouncing impunity and eliminating the climate of fear, addressing human rights violations of the past. Whether Burundi can charter a different course under Ndayishimiye is unclear, but Burundians must be hoping that it does. Thank you for listening.